Hello dear students and welcome back to K Gupta's online lecture series. In this video lecture we are going to deal with Marxist criticism. This theory is one of the important theories of literary criticism. Beginnings and basics of Marxist criticism or Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are the important philosophers of this school of thought. Karl Marx, a German philosopher, and Friedrich Engels, a German sociologist. These two were the joint founders of this school of thought. Karl Marx was the son of a lawyer, but Karl Marx spent most of his life in great poverty because he was a person who was in political exile from Germany living in Britain. He was expelled after 1848, year of revolutions. Engels had left Germany in 1842 to work in Manchester for his father's textile firm. They met after Karl Marx had read an article by Engels in a journal to which they both contributed. They themselves called their economic theories as communism rather than Marxism, designating their belief in the state ownership of industry, transport, etc., rather than private ownership. So they were in the favor of the state ownership of industry rather than the private ownership. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels announced the advent of communism in their jointly written Communist Manifesto. The aim of Marxism is to bring about a classless society based on the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Marxism is a materialist philosophy, that is, it tries to explain things without assuming the existence of a world or of forces beyond natural world around us and the society we live in. It looks for concrete, scientific, logical explanations of the world of observable fact. But whereas other philosophies merely seek to understand the world, Marxism seeks to change in it. Marxism sees progress as coming about through the struggle for power in different social classes. This view of history as class struggle regards it as motored by the competition for economic, social, and political advantage. The explanation of one social class by another is seen especially in modern industrial capitalism, particularly in its unrestrained 19th century form. The result of this exploitation is alienation, which is the state that comes about when the worker is de-skilled and made to perform fragmented, repetitive tasks in a sequence of whose nature and the purpose he or she has no overall grasp. By contrast, in the older pre-industrial or cottage industry system of manufacture, home and workplace were one. The worker completed the whole production process in all its variety and was in direct contact with those who might buy the product. These alienated workers have undergone the process of reification, which is a term used in Marx's major work, Das Kapital, but not developed there. It concerns the way when capitalist goals and questions of profit and loss are paramount, workers are bereft of their full humanity and are thought of as hands or the labor force so that For instance, the effect of industrial closure are calculated in purely economic terms. People in the world became things. There were various influences on early Marxist thinking in addition to that of political experiences of its founders, including the work of 18th-century German philosopher Hegel. Marxism also built upon socialist thinking which was produced in France at the time of French Revolution, and it inverted some of the ideas of early economic theory, especially the view that the pursuit of individual economic self-interest would bring economic social benefits to the whole of society. The simplest Marxist model of society sees it as constituted by a base. Base is a material means of production, distribution and exchange, and superstructure. Base and superstructure, which is superstructure is cultural world of ideas, art, religion, law, and so on. The essential Marxist view is that the latter are not innocent but are determined by the nature of economic base. This belief about culture, known as economic determinism, is a central part of traditional Marxist thinking. Marx and Engels themselves did not put forward any comprehensive theory of literature. Their views seem relaxed and undogmatic. Good art always has a degree of freedom from prevailing economic circumstances, even if these economic factors are its ultimate determinant. Thus, Engels, writing to the English novelist Margaret Harkness in April 1888, tells her that he is far from finding fault with you for not having written a point-blank socialist novel. The more the opinions of the author remain hidden, the better the work of art. As cultured and highly educated Germans, Marx and Engels had that respect for great art and literature which was typical for their class, and there is an obvious desire in such pronouncements to emphasize the difference between art and propaganda. All the same, Marxist literary criticism maintains that writers and its prevailing ideology have a major bearing on what written by a member of that class. So instead of seeing authors as primarily autonomous, inspired individuals whose genius and creative imagination enables them to bring forth original and timeless works of art, the Marxist sees them as constantly formed by their social context in ways which they themselves would usually not admit. This is true not just of a content of their work, but even of formal aspect of their writing, which might at first seem to have no possible political overtones. For instance, the prominent British Marxist critic Terry Eagleton suggests that in language, shared definitions and regularities of grammar both reflect the help to constitute a well-ordered political state. Likewise, Catherine Belsay, another prominent British left-wing critic, argues that the form of the realist novel contains implicit validation of the existing social structure, because realism, by its very nature, conventional ways of seeing intact and hence tend to discourage critical scrutiny of reality. By form, here is included all the loose conventional features of the novel chronological time scheme, formal beginning and endings, in-depth psychological characterization, intricate plotting, and fixed narrational points of view. Similarly, the fragmented absurdist forms of drama and fiction used by 20th century writers like Brecht and Kafka are seen as a response to the contradictions and divisions inherent in late capitalist society. However, it is probably true to say traditional Marxist criticism tend to deal with history in a fairly generalized way. It talks about conflicts between social class and clashes of large historical forces. But contrary to popular belief, it rarely discusses the details of a specific historical situation and relates it closely to the interpretation of a particular literary text. As Newton implies, this suggests one of the main differences between the Marxist criticism of 1960s and 1970s and the cultural materialist and new historicist criticism which came to the fore in 1980s, since latter very often dealt closely with specific historical documents and almost attempting in archaeological spirit to recreate state of mind of a particular moment in history. We have to understand Leninist Marxist criticism to understand Marxist criticism. A much harder line about literature than Marx and Engels themselves would have approved of was generally pursued by officially sanctioned Marxists, at least until 1960s. In 1920s, during the early years after revolution in Russia, the official Soviet attitude to literature and arts was very enlightened, and experimental and characteristically modern forms of art were encouraged. In 1930s saw reaction throughout the whole Soviet society, and the state began to exercise direct control over literature and arts as well as everything else. At the first Soviet Writers' Congress in 1934, liberal views were banned and new orthodoxy imposed. It was based on the writings of Lenin rather than those of Marx and Engels. Lenin had argued in 1905 that literature must become an instrument of the party. So it was the view of Lenin that literature should not be liberal and it should become an instrument of the party. Literature, he said, must become party literature. Literature must become part of organized, methodical, unified labors of social democratic party. So free literature was banned with the views of Lenin, and experimentation was effectively banned. Writers like Proust and Joyce were stigmatized, exemplars of bourgeois decadence. Joyce's Ulysses was denounced at 1934 Congress as a heap of dung crawling with worms, and straight realism was imposed, known as socialist realism. So, with the Soviet Writers' Congress in 1934, the liberal views were banned. Liberal literature were banned with the views of Lenin that literature must become an instrument of the party. And that's why that straight realism was imposed, and it was known as Soviet or socialist realism. It was known as socialist realism. In George Steiner's words, these conditions made literature impossible above the level of, say, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Steiner calls the two mainstreams of Marxist criticism the Engelsian kind, which stresses the necessary freedom of art from direct political determinism, and Leninist, which insists on the need of art to be explicitly committed to the political cause of the left. So there were two types of Marxist criticism were seen, Engelsian, which stresses on the freedom of art, freedom of literature, and another type was the Leninist Marxist criticism, which imposed control over the literature and it thinks that there should be the need of art to be explicitly committed to the political cause. Art should for the political cause of the left. Those abroad who were sympathetic to the ideas of communism tried to follow the Moscow line on matters where an official party policy existed. Hence the international influence of the Leninist views which formed at the 1934 Congress. Thus, in what came to be called the vulgar Marxism of 1930s, a direct cause-effect relationship between literature and economics was assumed, with all writers seen as permanently trapped within the intellectual limits of their social class position. A much cited example of this rigid kind of Marxist literary criticism is Christopher Caldwell's Illusion and Reality. Caldwell's writing is both very generalized in the sense that there is little detailed textual reference to the works of under discussion and very specific in the sense that every facet of writer is linked to some aspect of her or his social status. Thus, in Caldwell's discussion of Victorian poets, we read that vocabulary has foggy verbalism, which is the reflection of his intellectual dishonesty in dealing with real contemporary problems. Thus, a particular kind of vocabulary is the direct product of the middle class writer's evasiveness on sensitive social issues. Poets, all poets have their own form of escape from modern reality. Tennyson lapses into Keatsian dreamworld, Browning writes constantly on Italian medieval themes. To Tennyson, the Keatsian world of romance; to Browning, the Italian springtime, both are revolting backwards, trying to escape from contradiction of the class for whom they speak. The overall result is to provide little more than sound bites on literature for use in political argument. We have to understand Engelsian Marxist criticism. From 1930s, however, a rich variety of what Steiner calls Engelsian Marxist criticism flourished either in exile or in suppressed or underground form. So this Engelsian Marxist criticism flourished in underground form because it was banned by the Leninist criticism or the under the influence of Lenin. The group now called the Russian Formalists had flourished in 1920s until disbanded by the party and should be mentioned here even though their work is not strictly Marxist in spirit. The most prominent members of this group were Viktor Slovatsky, Boris Tomsharsky, and Boris Eichenbaum, whose work can be sampled in Russian formalist criticism. Four essays edited by Lee T. Lemon and Marion J. Reyes. Their ideas included the need for close formal analysis of literature, the belief that the language of literature has its own characteristic procedures and effects, and it is not just a version of ordinary language, and Slovatsky's idea of defamiliarization or making strange, which claims that one of the chief effects of literary language is that of making the familiar word appear new to us as we are seeing it for the first time. thus laying it open to revision. Another key formalist idea is Chomsky's distinction between story and plot. The story being an actual sequence of events as they would have occurred, and plot is artistic presentation of these events, which might involve reordering associations, repetitions, and so on in order to heighten their effect in the work of literature. As with the concept of defamiliarization, there is a careful distinction here between reality itself and its verbal representation in the work of literature, so that we are steered away from any notion that literature simply mirrors reality in a documentary way. Later, in early 1950s and 1960s, these formalist ideas were of great interest to the early structuralists, partly because of their emphasis on distinction between language and reality, and on literature as a set of systematic procedures and structures. Some of those associated with formalism, like Mikhail Bakhtin, remained in Russia, but others went into exile and continued their work abroad, thus sowing the seeds of the new forms of Marxist criticism which emerged in 1960s. One such exile was linguist Roman Jakobson, who continued his work in Prague, founding the Prague Linguistic Circle, the members of which include Ren Welek. Welek, like Jacobson, went to America shortly before the start of the Second World War and was influential in the movement known as New Criticism, which built upon number of these Russian formalist ideas, especially those concerning the need for close verbal analysis of literary text and the special recognition of literary language as a medium with its own characteristics that set it aside from day-to-day language. The suppressed Russian formalist also had an influence in Germany on the Frankfurt School of Marxist Aesthetics. The school was founded in 1923. Frankfurt School of Marxist Aesthetics was founded in 1923 as a political research institute attached to the University of Frankfurt. They practiced a form of criticism which tried to combine Freud and Marx, as well as aspect of formalism. The best known figures here are Walter Benjamin, who committed suicide while fleeing from Nazis in 1940. Also forced to flee from Germany was the playwright Bertolt Brecht, another opponent of the simplicities of doctrine of socialist realism. His notion of the alienation effect in drama involves devices which draw the attention of the audience to the fact that what they see on the stage is a constructed literary image, not a natural reality. For example, a director figure might sit at the side of the stage throughout a play, following the script in the book. Such a device is closely linked to the formalist idea of defamiliarization, since again it emphasizes a boundary or shift between literature and life. We have to understand the influence of Ulcer on Marxist criticism. Much recent Marxist thinking of literature has been influenced by the work of French Marxist theoretician Louis Ulcer, and his contribution will become clear if we outline some of the key terms and concepts he introduced. One such concept he introduced is the notion of overdeterminism, a word borrowed from Freud, which designates an effect which arises from the variety of causes. That is, from several causes acting together rather than from one single factor. The general purpose of Ulsterian ideas is to enable a much subtle view of how society works than that provided by traditional Marxism. Instead of force crudely applied from a single source, as from a lever, there is assent secured in many different and complex ways, and ideological power is shown to be of ultimately greater significance in its own right, not just a helpless and passive reflector of economic base where the real business of society goes on. The main tenet of Marxism is that the nature of literature is influenced by social and political circumstances in which it is produced, and it might well be immediately accepted as self-evidently true. In conclusion, we have to understand what Marxist critics do. They make division between overt, that is surface, and convert, that is hidden content of a literary work, and then they relate the convert subject matter to literary work of a basic Marxist themes, for example, class struggle or progression of society through various historical stages, such as the transition from Freudian to industrial capitalism. Thus, the conflicts in King Lear, for example, the conflict in King Lear might be read as being really about the conflict of class interest between the rising class and falling class. So, the drama by Shakespeare can be read in the light of Marxist criticism, and we can understand that this text may be the text for class interest between the rising class and falling class. Another method used by Marxist critics is to relate context of a work to the social class status of the author. In such cases, an assumption is made that author is unaware of precisely what he or she is saying or revealing in the text. So we have to understand the social status of the author, and then we can understand the text. A third Marxist method is to explain the nature of a whole literary genre in terms of social period in which produced it. For instance, The Rise of the Novel by Ian Watt relates the growth of the novel in 18th century to the expansion of the middle classes during the period. The novel speaks for the social class, just as, for instance, tragedy speaks for the rural and semi-urban working class. So Marxist critics, they relate the literary text with that period, and they relate that period and that text, and then they study from the light of Marxist criticism. A fourth Marxist practice is to relate the literary work to the social assumptions of the time in which it is consumed, a strategy which is used particularly in latter variant of Marxist criticism known as cultural materialism. So in fourth practice, Marxist practice, that a text can be understood by the social assumptions of that time. What were the social assumptions, contemporary social assumptions, and how that writer has written that social assumptions, how that assumptions influence the writer and that text. Fifth practice is the politicization of literary form. That is the claim that literary forms are themselves determined by political circumstances. So it is supposed that the literary text is determined by political situations of that time, political circumstances of that time. For instance, in the view of some critics, literary realism carries with it an implicit validation of conservative social structures. For other, the formal and material intricacies of the sonnet and the iambic pentameter are a counterpart of social stability, decorum, and order. So, in this way, we have discussed Marxist criticism in detail. Go through this video and listen and watch this video carefully. Will understand so many things about literary criticism, and for more information you can refer some books, you can refer some material on internet to understand the theory more. So thank you for watching this video and have a nice day.